My opinion is that Mr. Musk, he wants to sell as many Teslas as possible. And right now, it's viewed as kind of a greeny, liberal, tree-hugging product. By appealing to people on the right side of the spectrum, he could potentially sell tens or hundreds of millions of more Teslas.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today on the show, our guest is Alaska climate scientist Dr. Brian Brettschneider. We will discuss the fourth National Climate Assessment from 2018. Dr. Brettschneider is currently helping edit the fifth National Climate Assessment, which has not yet been released. We also discuss Brian's very popular Twitter account and whether or not he plans to stay on the platform now that Elon Musk has purchased it. Dr. Brian Brettschneider, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's get started by just finding out a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up?
Well, I am originally from Texas. I lived at times in the Houston, Texas area and other times in the Austin, San Antonio, Texas area. I spent a few years when I was a teenager living in the Chicago, Illinois area, but then moved back to Texas and then moved to Alaska about 17 years ago.
Well, I too am from the Houston area and spent a lot of time in the Austin area. So we have that in common. Where did you go to college?
So I went to a couple of colleges, but I ended up graduating and getting my PhD from what's now Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas, formerly Southwest Texas State University. They changed their name some years back. And so, that is my educational home, as it were.
And my understanding is that you did your thesis on hurricanes?
That's right. It is on the climatology of hurricanes. Growing up in Texas, I was always told, well, we got to look over by the Yucatan Peninsula, right? That's where we got to worry about maybe a hurricane coming from. And no one had ever really kind of looked into where do hurricanes come from that strike certain areas. So where should people in Texas? Where should people in Mississippi? Where should people in North Carolina? Where should they zero in on in the Atlantic Basin for storms that are most likely to impact them? And so the question had never been really asked in that way. And so that was something I was interested in. And that's what my dissertation topic was.
So where do those states need to look?
Well, it depends. If in the hurricane season, there's a lot of attention, say, that is focused on hurricane or systems that move off the coast of Africa as a tropical wave into what's called the main development region. But in reality, in 120 years, maybe 6 of those have struck Texas, for example. So even though there's a lot of interest in Texas about those storms that could be big and bad, the reality is they almost all go somewhere else. And so if you're in Texas, you are much more concerned about the stuff that forms in the Western Caribbean or the southwestern Gulf of Mexico. Whereas if you're in North Carolina, you're much more concerned about stuff that happens in the central tropical Atlantic. Florida can really, because of the shape of Florida, can really be kind of attacked from multiple different directions. But it's definitely not a one size fits all climatology.
So that is relevant information for those of us who are from the hurricane region, but not that relevant to Alaska. So right. How did you end up here?
So I was working for an environmental planning company in Texas. I'd worked there for some number of years. I guess maybe about, at that point, 6 years or so. And that company had gotten a couple of big projects in Alaska somehow without having an office in Alaska. And they wanted to use that as an opportunity to open up an office and maybe get more business. And they were looking for volunteers. And so we visited Alaska a few years prior and really liked it and thought, hey, maybe someday there'll be an opportunity to move up there. And so that opportunity actually kind of came up unexpectedly. So we took a leap and headed on up.
And what do you do?
Well, so right now, and for several years now, I am with the federal government. I'm with the National Weather Service in the Alaska Region Headquarters Office, located in Anchorage. And I am my job title, my Office of Management and Budget job title is physical scientist, but I'm a climate scientist. And so I refocused my climate skills, if you will, to everything Alaska and Arctic based. When I got up here, coming up on 2 decades ago, and so I do a lot of climate stuff for the National Weather Service. I also do other public outreach. I do a lot of kind of nuts and bolts computer weather model evaluation. Just all kinds of stuff. But at the core of it, I'm a climate scientist for the National Weather Service.
And can you explain how a climate scientist is different than a meteorologist?
Yeah, so a meteorologist really is looking at. I mean, you can think of it in timescales. So meteorology really is everything 14 days and less and under. So we're going to say, well, what's going to happen out the next 3, 4, 5, 10, maybe even out to 14 days. And it's solving, some kind of basic fluid dynamic equations of motion and, with different, what we call initial conditions, and trying to track how parcels of air, how they move through the atmosphere and also interact with the ocean and the ice and how those evolve over time. Now, what happens is there's so many moving parts that, if your initial conditions are just a little bit off, you end up with a completely different solution. And there's ways that we kind of tackle that. We have, we don't start at just one time right now and say what's going to happen in the next 10 days. We start at 25 different times or 50 times right now, and we fine tune, we change the initial conditions a little bit. And we see, how all of those evolve, and is there kind of a consensus among that? Climatology is really looking at things over longer time periods, and it can be not say maybe out past 14 days, so maybe a month, a year, 100 years. It's also looking backwards. What happened last month, last year, 100 years ago, a million years ago. And it's also looking at how things are connected across space. There's a saying in geography that's called the Tobler's first law of geography, and that is the closer things are together, the more similar they are. So we really want to see how these patterns exist and how we might be able to group things together and kind of learn about one place, maybe if we have knowledge about another nearby place. So. And when we talk about, say, a climate model is really kind of very different than a weather model. It's looking at broad flows. It's looking at ocean currents. It's looking at, the stratosphere. It's looking at the exchange of solar energy over large areas. So it's really kind of a fundamentally different beast, and that comes to be an issue at times when people say, "Oh, well, 2 days ago, the weather model said it was going to snow and it didn't snow. So, why should I trust a computer model that's going to go out 100 years? So, but I remind people that they operate fundamentally differently. The computer model, the climate model is not telling you what the chance of snow is going to be on December 12th, 2114, right? It's talking about how we see the evolution of ice and ocean temperatures and currents and aerosols and land cover changes and all those kind of things. So they really function quite differently.
Well, speaking of climate and climate change, can you tell us a little bit about what's different about climate change in Alaska as compared to other parts of the world?
Well, there's a lot of things that are different. And one of the things is we can see it. If you're in Kansas, it's hard to see climate change. You're being impacted by climate change in Kansas, but it's harder to see. if we drive down Seward Highway, we can look and see where, oh man, there used to be a lot of glacier there a few years ago, and now there's not. We can go over to Portage and say, I hike up to Portage Pass, every year, and I kind of hold my breath each time because I know the glacier is going to look vastly different each year. We go hiking in the mountains, and there's alders where there didn't used to be. So we really have the benefit, if you will, of being able to see it with our own eyes. Whereas if you're in Kansas or Kentucky or Nevada, you're to a large degree you're relying on the testimonial of somebody else. So there's that, but also so much of climate change revolves around the phase change of water from solid to liquid. And when you're crossing back and forth across that freezing line, you notice it. Big things happen. So for example, even as recently as 20 or 30 years ago, October was the snowiest month of the year for most places in the northern half of Alaska. Now it's not the snowiest month of the year really for any place, because a lot of that snow in October, now it's a couple of degrees warmer. Now it's falling as rain. So now November is the snowiest month. And that's something people notice. People, like here in Anchorage, they talk about, it used to be Halloween, 2 feet of snow, and it was minus 20, which, by the way, people tend to exaggerate that. That's and I do try to correct people on that, because if I kind of perpetuate something that's an exaggeration, then now my credibility is at stake. So sometimes people think, well, if I correct them that in this instance, it's not, as bad as you're making it out to be, they think I may be downplaying things, or that I'm some kind of apologist for, big oil or something. But I think it is important to have to be considered a credible resource on these things. And that means, being fair and true to the data. But anyway, and of course, so much of, especially in rural Alaska, the way of life is dependent on the climate. Everything we love about Alaska is Alaska is built up by geology, and it's shaped by climatology. And so really everything we love about it is a result of the climate that we have here, whether it's the game, the animals, the moose and the caribou and the bears, they're here because of the climate. Whether it's the salmon, they're here because of the climate. Whether it's, recreational opportunities, whether it's going out and seeing the glaciers and, whatever you can think of it, it's shaped very directly by the climate. And so as people are seeing how those things are changing, they're seeing that there's less caribou, they're seeing shrubby woodlands replacing tundra in many areas. And so we have the advantage in one sense of being able to really see it and kind of feel it in ways that you can't in other places.
You sent me the 4th National Climate Assessment from 2018, and I read the chapter about Alaska. And something that struck me was it talked a lot about rivers and the changing of rivers due to excess glacier melt, and how that was impacting communities that live near rivers. But which was interesting, because I think most people, when they talk about climate change, think about sea level rise, and they're not really thinking about river level rise, and the impact that could have. But it also talked about how in rural communities in Alaska, rivers in the winter are highways, and how by having a later freeze date and an earlier thaw date, you end up with people dying because they decide to use the river as a highway when it's not ready, because they're impatient. They've always used it by this time of year, etc. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that, because I just thought that was interesting, because I hadn't really thought about the rivers as part of climate change.
Yeah, well, you really, you hit the nail on the head, and that is that the rivers are the highways in rural Alaska. You get on the snow machine and you can travel, depending on the river, it's the Yukon or the Kuskokwim, hundreds of miles to visit, either to visit people, to pick up supplies, or most importantly, to hunt, or to go to trap, or to collect other resources. And we're seeing in many cases a month shorter of the year when you can do that. And so now there's often a mismatch between when these resources are available or ideally available for harvest, and the availability just to get there. And so sometimes you're going to be missing out on that. And also, up on the North Slope, the oil exploration activities, they're mostly, if they're out exploring, they have to build ice roads to get there. And they're very, very interested in ice road season and ice road potential. How much cold weather are we going to have, and when's it going to start, and when it's going to end? And that's something industry is extremely interested in. And ice road season is shrinking dramatically. And as permafrost thaws, we're getting changing groundwater levels. We're getting many of these kind of swampy areas that have always been underlain by ice. The ice thaws out and then they drain. And so now you're changing the hydrologic function of those areas. Now you're potentially making it more accessible or vulnerable to wildfires. And so there's a lot of overland issues with with water, and then melting glaciers. Very high river flows in the summer, creating lots of erosion. It's a problem on the Matanuska River, and then for interior rivers, many of the banks, like around Newtok, for example, the banks are permafrost, and so they're very susceptible if you raise the temperature a little bit to significant erosion. And so as you increase those summertime flows, you can just get tremendous changes in the location of the riverbanks that are, again, in some cases are causing communities to look to move elsewhere.
If we can, I'd also like to talk about the acidification of oceans. I think this is something that most of us who follow climate science have heard of, but don't, I think, maybe appreciate the impact of acidification of oceans. First of all, I guess, can you explain what is the acidification of oceans?
Yeah, so as we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, where the atmosphere, interacts with the ocean surface, it dissolves. The carbon dioxide in the air dissolves into the ocean, just like if you pour sugar or salt into a glass of water and you stir it up, it just dissolves in there. And as you add the carbon dioxide to the ocean, it changes the pH of the ocean water, and it makes it more acidic. I don't know exactly how all, but you end up with some carbonic acid, and shelled marine organisms that they're using carbon to make their shells. Well, now it's more acidic, and so now they're not able to make the shells that they've historically been able to, and that just has a whole rippling, cascading effect, trophic effect to the food chain. So some of these smallest organisms that can't make their shells now, all of a sudden, then the stuff that eats them, and then the stuff that eats those, and then the salmon, and then the dolphins, and the whales, and the sea lion. Pretty soon everyone is in trouble, and how much trouble is an open question. But those bottom rungs of the food chain are just critically important. And as we acidify the oceans, it's making it harder for those little critters to build up their shells.
And speaking of Arctic oceans and loss of sea ice, there was a little bit some things that were interesting that I hadn't thought about before. Speaking of the very tiny critters, that with the warming of like the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort, that you have the ability for certain organisms to move there that maybe didn't live there before. And that there had been a period where there was these organisms living on the surface, and then they would fall down and feed the very bottom. But now there's like this whole population of middle dwellers that used to not be able to be there that are now eating them, so they don't fall to the ocean floor, and so the things that used to expect them doesn't have them. And so I guess that's just another example of how the food chain is being disrupted to these really tiny things, and that is affecting the things that would normally have eaten them.
Yeah, and that's a big open question with salmon in particular. When salmon go out and forage, when they're in saltwater, it's kind of a black box. We don't always have a great idea where they're going. But to the extent that they're looking for food, they're chasing what they can find. And in some cases, what they're looking for is now gone, or something else has come in and already eaten it. I mean, it might have left in the first place because it was searching for better habitat, or those prey species might have just died, or now there's competition that there didn't used to be. And so, what happens way out in the ocean doesn't just affect, the commercial fish harvests. It affects what happens in the rivers. It affects the salmon that are making it to Tanana and to Eagle and into Canada, are affected by, potentially, fish competition that's happening, in the North Pacific Ocean, that might be affected or is being impacted by ocean acidification, which is causing, species to move, or species to die, or to be or competition to arise. So it's an extremely complicated set of events. But that said, sometimes people wave their hands up and say, well, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 moving parts, and we'll never be able to understand it. But that's not really true. I mean, there's one big moving part, and that is warming. And it's getting more, the ocean is acidifying. And and if you fix that problem, the other problems mostly take care of themselves. And so, to the extent that people feel overwhelmed by trying to understand, do a 1,000-piece Jenga, it's not, in another sense, it's not nearly that complicated. Now, that said, we can't fix this tomorrow. And we have people out there commercial fishing, and we have people that rely on fish coming in for subsistence. And we have people, that can't wait for this to be solved in 100 years or 200 years. They need some solutions now. So I appreciate that, but when people kind of throw their hands up and give up, that's not helpful.
What was interesting about the chapter that you sent me is that in the introduction, it said that they were going to talk about the negative and positive impacts of climate change to Alaska. And I think, it was a surprise because we don't really talk about the positive impact of climate change to Alaska. And it seems to me that from reading the chapter, they never really come right out and say this is a good thing, but they point out that you're going to have a longer growing season, for example. Mm-hmm. So as far as agriculture, like 20 to possibly even 40 days longer per year of growing season. Another thing that you just mentioned when talking about, the fish moving around and the change in temperature in the water allows different fish to be in different places. It says that there's a confirmed 20 new species in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas in the last 15 years, with 59, unexpected species found there. Maybe not living there, but swimming through. I'm wondering, I guess it's one of those small Jenga pieces, but or trying to find a silver lining in something that most people wouldn't look for. But are there positive impacts to Alaska from climate change?
So I think a little bit of background is helpful. For starters, that's the fourth National Climate Assessment. The fifth National Climate Assessment is almost ready for release. So I've read draft chapters, and they look quite a bit different. I think there was a feeling a few years back that there was a lot of doom and gloom and pessimism, and that there was an attempt to be kind of hopeful, and not both sides it, as it were, but to to get people from falling into the gutter and pouring themselves another drink. So maybe there'll be some more commercial or fish stocks that can be commercially harvested, and then certainly lower heating bills and a longer growing season. Those are tangible things that people. So I interact with gardeners a lot, and gardeners very frequently tell me, they say, I feel guilty about it, but man, I'm loving this warm weather for my vegetables. But I like to tell people, at some point, Alaska will be like Idaho, and I love Idaho. Idaho's a nice place to visit, but it's not as nice as Alaska. And as we warm, we're going to lose our glaciers, we're going to lose our tundra, and they'll become forested, and it'll just be different. Mm-hmm. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, there's these nice things. It's nice to have these nice things, I guess. It's just a few of the positives. So that's kind of, I think, the background on how. Now, I wasn't part of writing that one or reviewing it, but I think that's part of it. And the person that edited the Alaska chapter is an economist, not a climate scientist. And so I think there's, economists see things a little bit differently. And so I think that's part of the background on that. And I also think, look at the year that it was published, and look who, mm-hmm. look from the national
politically
politics
what was
point
happening,
of view, what was happening. And so things are different now, and I think you're gonna see that the next one has a much different feel. I mean, the last one had good science in it, no question, and it told the story, no question. I think it'll feel a lot different when the next one comes out here in the next few months.
Well, the way that chapter concluded was talking about the health impacts of climate change on humans, and there was a pretty I don't know if I'd say significant, but it talked about the psychological impact of being worried about climate change all the time and thinking that there was nothing you could do about it, and just constantly being fed this disaster scenario. The world is going to be a very unsafe and unpleasant place for your grandchildren, and hearing that over and over. So that might have been what he was trying to combat by putting some positive in there.
I just think I think it's human nature to want a little something, so that you're not feel like you're in a dystopian, horror film, that you can still appreciate that things are bad and we need to turn things around. Have the protagonist not get killed, at the end of the movie.
Right.
So,
well, speaking of climate change, human health effects, it spoke about having higher temperatures, particularly in interior Alaska, in places that do not have air conditioning for the most part, and that being a double problem, like with elderly people who maybe, can't really tolerate 95 degrees, not having some place to get away from the 95 degrees, but also that air conditions filter the air. And if you're having more wildfires and you're having poor air quality, the filtration systems on the air conditioner would actually help with the air quality. So sort of a double whammy by not having air conditions in Alaska. We not only are at risk for the higher temperatures in the summer, but also the poor air quality.
Well, I mean, the higher temperatures are going to, there's a whole cascading set of issues that go along with it. I mean, there's a reason that, you know, the population in Arizona didn't really take off until air conditioning was widely available. It's because it's not pleasant. It's not fun to be hot. And even though interior Alaska will never get as hot as Arizona, um, you know, the higher daytime temperatures, you know, it causes stress in the human body. The higher nighttime temperatures cause even more stress on the human bodies, on the human body. You know, air conditioning uses a lot of energy, a lot of electricity. You know, how are we gonna generate that electricity? You know, higher temperatures are going to dry things out in the interior, and paradoxically, we're going to have more thunderstorms, but we're going to be drier. We're going to have drier spells, so we're going to have more wildfires, and so we're going to burn more stuff. We're going to have worse air quality because of that. And so, you know, there's really no upside to having warmer summer temperatures. You know, there's just I can't think of a positive, you know, to say, well, you know, in Fairbanks, if we're going to go from 80 to, you know, to 87, you know, what's the silver lining to that? I don't really think there is a silver lining.
Well, again, back to some of the indirect effects on human health. With the loss of permafrost, you lose the ability to store food in a rural community that was using sort of like the freezers that they dug into the ground,
right.
As well as sort of sanitation systems where they had them built in such a way that the permafrost was kind of holding it in. When the permafrost melts, then you've got a sewage situation happening.
You know, and, you know, permafrost thawing, that's another, there's no silver lining to that. I mean, there's none, no silver lining. So like you said, we use it in rural Alaska for storing food as a natural refrigerator. When permafrost thaws, it has, you know, really expensive impacts to all sorts of infrastructure. Above ground infrastructure, below ground infrastructure, residences, roads, water. I mean, everything. It affects everything. Thawing permafrost drastically changes the hydrology. You end up with these what are called thermokarst lakes, and at other places, wetlands drain out, and making areas drier, more susceptible to fire, and more brushy. And now the caribou and moose can't get through, and that's not even mentioning the incredible amount of carbon that is locked away in permafrost, that when you thaw it, it is liberated into the atmosphere and accelerates future warming. So you know, people call it a ticking time bomb. So there are these very kind of tangible day-to-day, year-to-year effects on human health and people's lives. But there's also kind of this global you know, disaster movie scenario with that falling permafrost as well.
And I'm just throwing out some stats from the report in 2018 that about half of Alaska has permafrost, but that approximately 24% should disappear by the end of this century.
Yeah, boy, if you look at permafrost, you know, temperature probe time series, it's brutal. You look at, you know, places, say, you know, around Fairbanks that have very recent thawed permafrost. And so we have what we call continuous permafrost, and then we have intermittent, sporadic permafrost, discontinuous permafrost. And you know, it's in those marginal areas, particularly where, you know, it doesn't take very much of a rise in temperatures to change a landscape that's 50% permafrost to basically no permafrost at all. You know, it's just by its nature, those areas kind of already sit on the knife's edge. So, you know, if you're up in Dead Horse and you're on 1,000 meters of permafrost, well, you know, that's going to persist for a long time. But if you're around Fairbanks and there's 1 meter of permafrost, now that's a whole different story. And then, again, all the negative impacts that come with that thawing permafrost are going to be very short-term impacts that are going to be felt on very short timescales.
One thing that I loved about Alaska, coming from Southeast Texas, was that we didn't have a lot of insects, and living in a hot, wet place such as the Houston area, it was nice to be someplace that didn't have ticks and fleas and roaches and all the things that we dealt with growing up. Snakes, yeah, exactly, and not having to worry about chiggers, the worst. Uh-huh. But in the 2018 paper, they talk about, we already see the expansion of the ticks into southern parts of Alaska, and that there are many insects that would love to move in, which would be obviously a major bummer to those of us who moved here to get away from all of that.
Yeah, so when you move north, to colder climates, you end up with pretty much everywhere less species diversity as far as wildlife and botanical, and that's just because the cold temperature just freezes out a lot of stuff that hasn't evolved to handle that. Everything's handled to evolve above freezing temperatures, but not nearly as many have evolved to handle below freezing and really, really far below freezing temperatures. And even the bugs that we do have, so mosquitoes and black flies and so on, the white socks. We don't really have to deal. We don't have to deal with mosquito-borne, vector diseases like West Nile virus, like encephalitis or malaria, and those are going to be coming someday. Hopefully not for a while. But yeah, in June I can lay out in a grassy area and take a nap, and you can't do that in most places. You're going to get chewed up, or you're going to get ants crawling all over you, or whatever. And we can do that. Now, of course, in the northern part of the state, there's the period where there's not many mosquitoes is not very long after the snow melts, and then the mosquitoes start exploding in population on the tundra, especially, and in heavily forested areas. But yeah, the ticks are coming.
So I'm going to make an assumption that as a climate scientist that you know a lot about what is happening with climate and what's going to happen with climate. And so I guess I'm going into an area that I acknowledge may not be your expertise, but how do we stop it? How do we fix it?
Well, and by fix, I assume you mean, or stop or fix, we stop the warming or we reverse the warming. Mm-hmm. And, from a thermodynamic point of view, it's a pretty simple equation, right? We've added gases to the atmosphere that trap heat, and they've done exactly that. They've done what they were built to do atomically, and that is trap heat. So the solution to it is to have less of that. I mean, that's the math equation. Now, kids in school say, well, when am I going to ever use this kind of math? And a math equation, is fine for a classroom, but let's talk real world stuff here. And so, I think if you look at trajectories, the emissions are moving in the right direction. The worst case climate scenarios we feel are kind of off the table now. The RCP 8.5, the mega warming. Now, that's not because we did a bad job projecting before, but it's because we've already made significant improvements globally as a global community. Is it enough? Well, certainly not. It's not enough to to stem the tide. But we are moving in the right direction, and internationally and nationally, there are pretty firm commitments that we're going to have a certain percentage of vehicles that are electric, a certain amount of our electrical generation that's going to be renewable from renewable resources. I mean, those things matter. I mean, it matters 20 years ago that the government made refrigerators more efficient and mandated that they were more efficient. That's had a tremendous effect on our electrical utilization. And it's kind of a hidden thing that people don't think about. But those things, they all add up. And we are heading in the right direction. We can't let our foot off the gas, as it were. But it's really a two-pronged solution. One is we flatline and reduce the emissions. But the thing about carbon dioxide is it lingers in the atmosphere for several hundred years. Eventually, we will need a carbon capture sequestration program. Now, the natural version of that is trees, right? Trees capture carbon, but that's not a long-term solution. Most of the areas that can be covered in forests already are covered in forests. We can fine tune it, but that's only a small piece of the solution for carbon sequestration. So we'll really have to come up with other things to do to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Now, that said, one of the traps that people fall into is they say, well, eventually, the scientists will figure it out and they'll save us from ourselves. And that's not really the case, and we really can't count on that. The thing is, we have the technology right now, basically, to limit the warming. We don't have to invent any kind of futuristic thing. We don't have to do, fusion electrical generation or whatever. We have the technology. We renewable energy resources and kind of a changing of our electrical grid and the way that we overall consume power is basically enough to get us to at least stop the warming. And future technology would be certainly helpful, but we don't need it. And so again, as a country, for 5 decades, we've kind of always counted on well, in the future they'll have this figured out, and in many cases we do, but sometimes we don't. But we don't have to wait for the future to figure it out. We have it figured out. We just have to decide if we're willing to do something.
I want to close by talking about your Twitter account. Tell us a little bit about how your Twitter personality got started and how that's evolved.
Well, it is kind of ironic that we're talking about this now as potentially Twitter is imploding.
That was my follow-up question, was how long you were going to stay on Twitter.
So, well, I'll get to that. But it's something that when there are community, there are people that are into birding, and there's people that are into fishing, and there's people that are into historic buildings and Renaissance painting, and really social media, for all of its quirks and negatives, is a way to bring people with similar interests together. And weather and climate is one of those things that everyone experiences it. You walked outside, you experienced weather and climate today. Everyone who's listening experienced weather and climate today. And so it's a shared experience that we all feel like we know something about it, or we have something to offer, or maybe we want to know something more. And so there's kind of this natural gravitation in some ways to people who have weather and climate information. My background in geography, I spent many years making maps When I worked for this environmental planning company, I spent, half my time with a machete hacking through the woods of East Texas and South Louisiana, delineating wetlands. But the other half of the time, I was making maps professionally. And I still do that to this day. Every day, every day that ends in a Y, someone's asking me, hey, can you help me with this map? And so, maps are something that people really can connect with. We have this connection with maps that we don't have with a table or a chart or a paragraph. And not that literature and writing is bad. I don't mean to imply that, but people, there's a connection that people have with maps that I think that is unique in many ways. And so having this ability to make maps, having this background in weather and climate, really, a lot of the Venn diagrams, are overlapping with a lot of other people's interests. And quite frankly, Alaska is an exotic place for a lot of people. They want to know about Alaska. They want to know if we live in igloos, or they want to see pictures of moose, or they want to see, people plan on their
or a picture of a string of bears walking down the road. And actually, I had people text me saying I had to ask about that picture.
Yeah.
So can you describe the picture and tell me where it came from?
Yeah. So if you notice on the tweet, it said photo credit E. Holloway. So it's not my picture, but it is from Midtown. I mean, like one
Midtown
block,
Anchorage.
Yeah, or actually just one block south of Northern Lights Boulevard, near the Anchorage Baptist Temple. And I was in a meeting, like a Zoom meeting or something for work, and one of the people in the meeting was also working from home and said, "Hey, guess what just passed by my house a few minutes ago?" And he doesn't have a Twitter account. So I asked him if I could post it with credit. He said, "Yeah, go ahead."
How many bears was it?
It was 4. There's 4 bears. And apparently they've been seen at times, around the Baxter Bog area throughout the summer. And I just assume all the bears are, you always hear stories of straggling bears, through the winter, and someone will post a picture of a bear paw print in the snow in January, But I put away my bear spray for the season, and I think most people already have as well. But so that's the bear photo. But Alaska's exotic. People like to see pictures of northern lights, of moose and bear, and glaciers and stuff. And so I have a lot of people that kind of follow me for that. And scientists historically have been not always, of course, a pretty serious bunch. And, I consider myself a serious scientist, but I don't consider myself a serious person. And so I'm always, laughing and trying to have fun, and I'm completely self-deprecating about a large number of things. And so, I do like to be humorous, and, there'll be a cold snap and I'll say, hey, we're under a blue warning, because all the colors are in blue, or whatever. So there's a there's a market, if you will, for that kind of self-deprecating humor, which I think a lot of scientists are trained to not do. We've got to be credible, and we've got to be the people that are looked up to, and and so on and so forth, and that's fine for them if they want to do that. But to me, life's too short to not have fun.
And are you going to keep having fun?
That lets people, that gives the impression that you're approachable. And so, if someone with 10 followers, asks me a question, I'll answer it. If someone with 10,000 followers asks me a question, I'll answer it. As long as they're being genuine, and asking something with the right kind of intentions. So that and for whatever reason, you can never explain why lightning hits in one spot and not another. And so, at least at the moment, I think I have the 5th or 6th most Twitter followers in Alaska.
How many do you have right now?
It's about like 35 or 36,000. So our our congressional delegation, they each have more. I think the singer Jewel has more, and there's one or two other people that have more. And so I kind of take pride in that. I'm one of two people that Greta Thunberg, like the Swedish climate activists, follow. I have, probably a quarter of my followers are media, maybe a quarter are other scientists, and the other half is everyone else. So I think that's a good mix. I try to put enough actual unique science in there that I need to do that so that I need to be taken seriously a little bit so that the humor can be funny and not trying to mask some kind of other deficiency. And as far as am I going to stay on Twitter, a lot of people are really talking about where they're going to move to post Twitter. This I probably have a minority opinion, but it's I'm a proponent of staking out minority opinion or staking out opinions for accountability later on. If I'm going to be wrong, I expect to be called out on it. So here's my opinion on where it's going. My opinion is that Mr. Musk, he wants to sell as many Teslas as possible. And right now it's viewed as kind of a greeny liberal tree-hugging product. And by appealing to people on the right side of the spectrum, he could potentially sell tens or hundreds of millions of more Teslas. That's my personal opinion, and that it's very performative and not as real as a lot of people think it is. I do think that there will probably be some changes. I mean, you see a lot of people for $8 a month, buying the verified badge and impersonating, other people or other companies or whatever. And I think they'll clamp down on that. I think whenever people try to, start a kind of a libertarian utopia, they realize that even the people that don't want any government still want their roads plowed, and they still want their mail delivered, and they still want the firefighters to come out if their house is on fire. And so, Mr. Musk is a famous libertarian, and I think he'll realize that that people demand those kind of backstops. Now, it was a terrible investment, and he's never going to recoup that loss. And so I don't know what the plan is from a financial point of view, but I really don't see an alternative popping up. I mean, Google tried their Google Plus, I think, as an alternative to Facebook, and that kind of failed spectacularly. Facebook made a few cosmetic changes that Google Plus had done that were probably good ideas, but Facebook ended up, in many ways, kind of failing, on its own, because the way it prioritized, advertising and reshaped their algorithm. You never knew if your posts. I used to have a Facebook climate page, and I pretty much abandoned it because it stopped showing up in most people's feeds. And so I feel like I was doing all this work that was for naught. So so I wonder if Twitter might try to do something like that, but really there hasn't been a Facebook alternative. I mean, yeah, there's been other social medias, there's been TikTok and Snapchat and stuff, but they haven't really replaced it. So I don't think there's going to be a viable replacement for Twitter. I think people will kind of grind their teeth and say how awful it is, and we'll keep on using it. And the Mastodon is people are trying to kind of move toward that, but it's kind of unwieldy and not very easy to use, and your reach is much more limited. When I had my Facebook page, in 5 years, I think that generated two media interviews. I got like, hey, I saw this. Can we talk about it? my Twitter account has generated hundreds of interviews, and I've been on BBC and CNN and all the, CBS and NBC and ABC World News Tonight, all their nightly news programs, and I don't say that as a hey, look at me, patting myself on the back, but just as a function to demonstrate how the reach is very different, and it's allowed me to tell the story of what's happening with the climate in Alaska, and I don't see any kind of viable competitor to that. So unless it's really obviously going down the toilet, which even though people are saying it is, it's not. I'm going to hang in there, and I won't be the last holdout, but I don't see a need or a reason to jump ship just yet.
Well,
and I think it's worth saying that, and I know I've grown on about this for a while, but it's not I think there's a lot of people that really viscerally dislike Elon Musk, and I personally am not a fan in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's a little bit dangerous to say, well, I'm going to not support this person I don't like's business venture because I don't like them. It's to some degree, that's the game that people on the right have played for years. Oh, the fake news and fake CNN and stuff, and they feel like, well, I'm not going to participate in that because I don't like who owns it or whatever. So, as long as they're not, committing human rights violations, I think as long as the business model, maybe another good example is Fox Sports. They showed the World Series this year. They show 2 football games every Sunday, and people don't boycott them because they don't like the news branch of their media organization. They say, well, they're keeping that separate, and they're doing their football or baseball thing or whatever, and that's just the way it goes. And so I feel perfectly at ease using Twitter and not liking Elon Musk at the same time.
Gotcha. Hey, last question we ask of all of our guests, and I'm kind of springing this on you, but can you recommend a book to our listeners? It doesn't have to be particularly about climate. It could be about anything, but anything you think our listeners should read.
So I'm gonna say something that's going to be kind of unpopular with probably you and probably your listeners, and that is, I'm not a big book reader. I read a lot of articles. I read a lot of reports. But I've never been great at sitting down and reading 300 pages of something. That said, there's a book that's now about 15 or 17 years old by Charles Woolforth. Probably a lot of your readers have heard of it, and it's The Whale and the Supercomputer. And it really, really captures, in many ways, kind of the overlaps and the disconnects between how scientists, with air quotes, perceive the climate and study the climate, and how indigenous, Native Alaskans view, treat, analyze the climate. And these don't have to be mutually exclusive worlds that they live in, but it does a good job of describing those two worlds. So that's a book I've at times recommended to people. And so for your listeners, if they haven't seen that or familiar with it, that's one I would encourage them to check out.
Well, I was going to hold up. I thought I had a Charles Woolforth book next to me, but he co-wrote To Russia with Love, which was Vic Fisher's memoir. And Vic Fisher has been a guest on our podcast twice. So,
oh, wow. I love Vic. Yeah.
Yeah. So, hey, thank you so much for being on the show today. And thank you so much for staying on Twitter. I will continue to follow you, and I'm sure many of our listeners will as well.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I appreciate you reaching out and really asking some great questions. Thank you.
Thank you to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his YouTube channel, Anchorage Life, and his website, anchoragelife.net, about life here in Anchorage. Thank you to you, our listeners. Next week, we will celebrate the 80th birthday of the Alcan Highway with our second interview with author Christine McClure, discussing her and her husband's most recent book about the construction of that monumental road. A Different Race, World War II, the Alaska Highway, and a court-martial. Please tune in.